They did a terrific job for us last year. So we were going to plan to do that again. So a lot of good things. At any rate, today we have Dr. Norman Dann here, who has researched in extraordinary detail the life of Gerrit Smith. And there are books here. So if you pick one up, you know, get a good grip because they're pretty heavy. He's done a terrific job, and really he has access to sources about this man's life. This Gerrit Smith, living in Peterborough, how did he make all his money?
I'll tell you.
You're going to tell. Okay, this guy made a fortune. A lot more than we have, I'll tell you that.
You're not going to give the plot away.
No, no.
Chuck, do you know where Peterborough is?
Yes. Well, if you don't know, he'll tell you that too. And so he's made his fortune, but he's also involved in other activities such as prohibition of slavery, women's rights, prohibition, in case you guys think you've been drinking too much, that may have helped you. But anyhow, Dr. Norman Dann here is also a silversmith. You can see some of his artwork here before you. And for many years taught at Morrisville College. And here he is.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. We have a T-shirt in Peterborough that we sell, part of our Civil War weekend, one of the historical features that we do there. It says, "Where is Peterborough?" Across the front. On the back, it says, "Just south of Clockville, west of Fenner, and east of Siloam." So you see now you know right where. We love the question because we want to tell people where we are. A heck of a lot going on in Peterborough. It will boggle your mind if you haven't been around there or read in the newspapers or anything what's going on. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is now open in Peterborough. The Gerrit Smith Estate, that's one institution. The Gerrit Smith Estate National Historic Landmark is now open to the public with a public visitor center that's open. And there's signage going in. You might have seen a couple of them around the village there already if you've driven through. This coming summer, we're going to have many thousands of dollars worth of signage put up around the village with electronic accessibility. You can punch your cell phone and listen to the narrative of, you know, what is important about this spot. So you can give yourself your own little guided tour through the Peterborough area. But most people who don't know much of anything about Peterborough that are interested in history, you start talking with them about it, their jaw drops. Really? Did that happen here? You just can't believe it. And it's about time we got this stuff out so that people who are interested in history know what happened around central New York, actually, with Peterborough as one of the little hubs of what happened. And then that, of course, was because of Gerrit Smith and all his money. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Brought some stuff with me, handouts really. You can pick these up and talk about the National Abolition Hall of Fame, the Gerrit Smith Estate as a National Historic Landmark, etc. There are books here for sale. There's a couple that I have written. This one deals with the Underground Railroad and what we know about it, documented. It's actually a primer for someone who doesn't know a lot about slavery or the Underground Railroad to begin with, but wants to. The first part of the book deals with the institution of slavery. The second part, what happened to an escaped slave when they were on the road, risking everything to try and get out of the South. What did they face? And the third part is what happened when they got there. And in this particular case, of course, the destination is Peterborough. And you could use any destination. There were Underground Railroad stations in Fabius and Casanova all around. But this one we could document a lot about because of the work I've done with Gerrit Smith. So there's over 100 cases of slaves going through Peterborough they can actually document. And that's rare. Normally, people didn't write much about that kind of stuff because it was against the law. They were breaking federal law by running an Underground Railroad station. So this one is the biography of Smith, Practical Dreamer. It's a 14-year project. So people say, why did you write so much? It just, I had to cut it down. You know, he's a very complex man and very misunderstood, I believe, in terms of what has been known and written about him in the past. There were 3 other biographies written about Smith, mainly a long time ago. The last one was written 71 years ago, and in the 30s. And the other 2 were written just after he died in the late 1800s. And they were either glowing eulogies to this noble, wonderful man that did so much good stuff. 2 of them were like that. And the third one, the one that was written in the 30s, was a caustic, sarcastic criticism of this fool that wasted his money. So, you know, what people did in the past was malign him in a way by writing about him on his extremes. Either he was such a wonderful person or he was such a fool. Well, you can do that with any of us, I suspect. It's easy to write about somebody's extremes, because that's what makes news. But what are you really like? See, that's what I tried to get at, and I found something very different than what had been written before. Anyway, that's there if you want to buy those. And before I forget to do it, I'll make one recommendation about the biography. If you do decide to read this, I think the best approach would be to go to the table of contents here. Pick out what it is you like the best. Everybody has got some topic that's going to interest them more than something else. If you like religion, read the chapter on religion first. If you like business, read the chapter on business first. You know what I mean? Get a feeling. Get yourself into it and feel for the man. Then go back and read all of it. So that's just my recommendation. I also, but people often say, why don't you bring something that gives me a sense of Peterborough's history? So I did. I do sterling silver craft work. I didn't bring any of that. This is just Peterborough glass, and there's a little story here you may have read already about it. That one of the things Smiths did in business was run a glass factory. It was right there in Peterborough, and it only operated until 1826. So almost 200 years ago that this stuff was made. And when the place got plowed for a cornfield, about 7 years ago, I got permission from the owner to mow there. I looked around after it rained. That's what I found. So these are pieces out of probably their waste pile. And I haven't done anything but mount them. They just mounted as such. And about half of the price of these would be donated to the Peterborough Historical Society. So you're supporting us as we help you in some way here. You can look all this stuff over later. One of the people I need to talk about, and I think I'll start with him, before we get into Smith, is Theodore Dwight Weld, because he was an extremely important abolitionist who lived in Fabius. And I found out just a few minutes ago that probably not in the village of Fabius, but in the town of Fabius, perhaps down around the Peculiar Station. I've never researched him that far. I reread part of his biography this morning, which I own, and it never mentioned anything but Fabius, but it probably was the township of Fabius. I'm not sure exactly where in the town he lived. But he moved here with his family as a young man in 1825. And he became a scholar. He went to school started actually in Andover, Mass. He was born in Connecticut. Went to school in Andover, Mass. But then moved out here to central New York because his father became the minister of the Fabius Presbyterian Church. Now, I don't know which one that is. Do you? See, that's something that you might want to poke into someday and find out exactly where this guy preached. But it was the Fabius Presbyterian Church, and there may be more than one around the town of Fabius. But then Theodore, his son, went to school at the Oneida Institute, which is up near Utica. It's in Whitesboro now. It's called Whitestown then. And because it was an interracial school, probably one of the very first interracial schools in the country. And he was there for a while. Then he went to Lane Seminary in Cincinnati. He got involved in a big beef at Lane Seminary as a student with the administration over the issue of slavery. The administration wouldn't allow students to form an anti-slavery society. So the students said, well, to you, and they all left. A lot, 24 of them left. And that was a big portion of the student body then. And they went to Oberlin College, you know, down in Ohio there also, but and that was an interracial school too. But that's where he got interested in abolition, when he was in these interracial schools. And he spent a good portion of about the next 10 years lecturing on abolition all over the country. He did so much of it, and he was so good at it, that he lost his voice. And they had to drop out of it for a long while. But he was one of the main, major organizers of the work of the American Anti-Slavery Society in the mid-1830s. Hard worker. Anyway, look into him. I brought this along. This is a picture of him here, under my finger. There's only one known picture of Theodore Well, and actually it's a drawing. But that's Theodore. And he was inducted into the National Abolition Hall of Fame last October. And this coming October, on the 23rd, I wrote that in here. This was the program for the induction. This is over. But I wrote in down here in case somebody here wants to pick up on it. On October 23rd, 2010, coming up, next October, we're going to have a symposium commemorating Theodore Well. So if you're interested in coming around and learning a lot more about him, that would be the time and place to do it. And if anyone, individual, or perhaps the Fabius Historical Society is interested in having your name permanently printed on Theodore Dwight Wells' banner as it hangs in the National Abolition Hall of Fame, a $50 donation will do that. You can get either your own personal name or the Fabius Historical Society put on it. I don't do this in many places where I go to talk. I thought this connection with Wells was a good one for you folks. I'll leave that out here too, in case you want to pick that up. All right. Who the heck was Gerrit Smith? He was wealthy. You've already heard Chuck say that. He was, in our terms today, he would be a multi-billionaire. Unreal. He had so much money. He could do anything he wanted. He attracted all kinds of people. And somebody with that much money is a man. He had beggars going through Peterborough. He lived in Peterborough. He lived there for 68 years, essentially all his life. He moved to Peterborough with his family in 1806 when he was 9. As a little boy. Bounced around there in Peterborough and then spent his whole adult life there. He went to college in Clinton at Hamilton College, graduated in 1818. The day after he graduated from college, his mother died. And he was very, very close to his mother and very distant from his father. His father and he had a lousy relationship. That's another part of this book. The first part of the book deals with the personal life of Gerrit Smith. If you like relationships as issues, read that first. Some interesting things in there. And after his mother died, his father, who owned this business, he owned the land business. It was buying and selling land. That's how he made his money. Purchasing and selling land. That's why the little brick building that's still right on the corner there in Peterborough is called the land office. He didn't have an office in the house. He had his office out there in the land. It was 70 feet from the house, and he commuted every day, 70 feet. What do they call it? And the roads weren't plowed in the winter, so what else could you do, right? But he didn't want the money. Interesting aspect of a person, isn't it? I mean, if you were successful and made $100,000, wouldn't you want to use it? I think I would. He didn't want any of it. So he became a philanthropist. He simply means he gave it away. Gave away all his money. His family even had to beg him for money when they wanted to do something. He lived very simply, not much opulence or display, and because he wanted to use the money for other causes. Well, what were the causes? Anybody, he said, who is in any way oppressed deserves the money more than I do, because they need to do things they can't do otherwise. So who comes to mind immediately? Slaves, women, sick people, poor people. And he just gave it all away. Well, how come you've never heard of him before? How come he isn't in the history books in your classes you taught? Because that's the way he wanted it. He didn't want accolades and praise for what he was doing. When he never gave away a lot of money, a big chunk, to any one thing that would carry his name. So he never became famous. He wasn't an important person in the business world, like the oil magnates, you know, Carnegie and Rockefellers and things like that. He never did that kind of stuff with his money. He didn't donate it to a college to have it put on that as a name. He was asked, by the way, by Andrew White, who was in the process of forming Cornell University. He was asked to donate to that because he had so much money. He said, you guys will get your money somewhere else. The guy down the road, the barn just burned. He needs my money. So that's what he did with it. Well, that wouldn't make much news. See? And it never resulted in any kind of a public legacy for the man that got handed down. That's just the way he wanted. There were three master themes that characterized his life. We'll do these quickly. Then I'll get into the reform movements that he worked so hard on. Business, religion, and politics. Now, we've already said a little bit about the business. He ran a land business. He did a lot of land purchases through tax sales. Makes sense. I mean, it's a cheap way to get land, and you hold it a little while and then sell it, and you're probably going to make money on it. Well, of course, he made millions on it. I can trace in the records, which, by the way, are at Syracuse University. The mother lode of papers are at Syracuse University upstairs in their special collections division in the library there. And it's extensive. There are 155 boxes of papers, and the handwriting in it is atrocious. There is an example of Gerrit Smith's handwriting. I had to scan a couple of them in there just to bug you if you read it. It's not easy to read. There wasn't much of the penmanship back in those early days. And of course, nothing is printed. Very little is printed. And as part of his business, he made so much money that he would give it away. And the reason being, he said, I can't do my work if I don't have a lot of money. So I've got to work hard to make all this money, but I don't want it. So that's where it went. And also as part of his business was this glass factory. Although this only operated until 1826, and he lived until 1874. So if you're interested in a little physical piece of Peterborough history, or what an abolitionist might have done in some of his time, this is an example of it. Most of them had side businesses of some kind. You know, Garrison was a journalist, etc. Abolition was sort of their passion, but they had to make money doing something. On the politics angle, frequently people know from what they've read or heard that Gerrit Smith was a national congressman. Did you know that? He got elected to Congress in Washington, the House of Representatives. In 1852, he hated politics. He detested it intensely. I got a bunch of quotes in there to tell you, show you just exactly how much he disliked politics. Well, why would he allow himself to be elected or something? He said things like, don't ever elect me, I don't ever want to be a public official, don't ever nominate me for anything, I want to stay in Peterborough and run my business and help people as much as I can, and I can't do that kind of stuff in Washington, so don't send me there, or to the state, even. Well, in 1852, he got nominated by public acclamation. He wasn't on the ballot. You know, I mean, he didn't run for office. People nominated him anyway. The party nominated. It was an abolition party. And the people around central New York thought so much of him, they elected him. And he was all the time not campaigning. He was telling them, don't vote for me, don't elect me, I don't want to go there. And he said it anyway. And he went down there, and he had a 2-year term to serve. Well, he served 1 year of his 2-year term, resigned, and came back to Peterborough. He said, I can do more good for the reform issues that I'm interested in here in central New York than I can in Washington. And why is that? Very simple. The Congress and the government in Washington at that time in the early 1850s was still controlled by slave owners. It was controlled by what's called the slave power. That is, there was more power in the organization coming out of the South in votes and influence than there was from the North. He could get nowhere with abolitionist ideas. So he frustrated himself for a year down there, then quit and came home. Well, One thing he did do in politics that remains, I think is very interesting, when we have campaigns and politicians come around central New York to Peterborough, as they often do, and they want to shake your hand and introduce themselves and hand you a little piece of literature, and I say, sir, do you know, or ma'am, do you know where the Republican Party started? And then they start staring at their shoe tops. They don't really know the history of it. They just run them like crazy for some office somewhere. I hope I'm not offending any politicians. But anyway, they say, no, I don't know. I said, well, you're standing on it. Gerrit Smith and a few other men at the time, and women couldn't vote, you know, way back, so got together and they said, you know what, the two major parties, the Whigs and the Democrats at the time, are both pro-slavery. They're not going to do anything about electing people to Congress or to state assembly or even local offices that are going to do anything about abolition, because they're all pro-slavery. Major parties. What do? Start our own. So they met 4 or 5 different times right around central New York here, sometimes actually in Peterborough, sometimes in other neighboring communities, and decided to start a new party they called the Liberty Party. Nice name for an abolitionist party, and that was its one issue. Well, you probably know enough about the history of one-issue third parties to know what happened. Didn't do much, but it got the word out. See, that's what they wanted to do. They knew they weren't going to get elected president, but they wanted people to know that there was a developing movement that was saying something right about abolition of slavery. So they did this. To shorten the story for you, they did this in 1840. By the end of the 1840s, the Liberty Party had split up into different factions and gone sort of different ways. But they were still all anti-slavery people. They began to get in communication with other anti-slavery factions within the major parties. So there was some anti-slavery Whigs and some anti-slavery Democrats, and then the Free Soil Party developed as a part of this whole movement. That is, no slavery west of the Mississippi, that idea. And they finally got brilliant and said, look, let's all get together. So all of these factions coalesced into a new party called the Republican Party in 1854. They nominated their first candidate for president in 1856, a guy named John Fremont. He lost, he didn't get many votes, but you know, they got going anyway. They had another presidential candidate nominated in 1860 that actually ran against Gerrit Smith because he was nominated by one of the abolition parties that year, and this other guy's name was Abraham Lincoln. Now the story you know from there. So Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, and in those days the Republicans were the liberals. They were radical liberals, human rights people who cared about the slave and women and somebody who was discriminated against. That has changed drastically over the last few years. And I know I'm offending someone now, but I really don't mind offending people. Don't take it personally. The Republican Party doesn't have much of an interest in human rights these days, as does the Democratic Party. That's because of the change that came about during the late 1800s when the economy got so darn good and the big trusts were built and developed and people made loads of money and wanted to hold on to it. So that's what they did. And in order to hold on to it, they had to become conservative. So the issue flipped. And the Democratic Party became the more liberal party and the Republican the more conservative party, as it still is. But anyway, the Republican Party started right here, right in central New York, over the issue of slavery and freedom and liberty for slaves. So that's his big donation to politics as far as the nation goes. It was the commencement of the Republican political party. And then in religion, the other master theme in his life, he started out as a college student up in Clinton as an agnostic. He could care less about religion. He didn't want much of anything to do with it, even though his father had been a religious person, a devout religious person. He didn't like his father. As I mentioned, he had a bad relationship with him, and he wasn't interested in his business even, which his father had started. His father was Peter Smith, who was in partnership with a guy from downstate named John Jacob Astor. And the two of them, as young men, started a business trading with the upstate Native Americans in furs. And the fur trade, of course, made them rich. They trade for these furs from the upstate Native Americans for pennies, but take them down to New York City and sell them for hundreds. And they built, both of them built huge fortunes. That's the way the Astor fortune got started and the Smith fortune. Well, when Peter Smith, right after, as I mentioned before, Gerrit Smith's mother died the day after he graduated from college. That was, of course, Peter's wife. Sent him reeling into depression, as you might imagine. And he said, I don't even want to do my business anymore. You take it. So he gave it to his son. He gave the business to his son. Sold it to him. There was, it's hard to talk about that. He really didn't give it to him, and he didn't inherit it. You know, the guy hadn't died. He just retired like that. And eventually moved out of Peterborough. Lived in Schenectady until he died. But so Gerrit now takes over this business in 1819, right after he got out of college. He didn't want it. He wanted to go on in school and become an attorney. Never went back to school again. He got into this business and had to run it. Took all his time, but he did a lot of good from the benefits of it. And one of the ideas, as I started out on, was religion. And in college, he didn't want anything to do with religion. And he drank, and he got drunk, and he played cards, and he gambled, and he goofed off, and he got in trouble, probably like a lot of us did when we went to college. He married the daughter of the Clinton College president. 7 months later, she died. And if you want the story of her life and death, it's in there to read about. 3 years after that, he remarried. And he remarried a young woman, 17 years old, named Anne Carroll Fitzhugh, from a slave-holding family in Maryland. Now, you begin to weave that into an abolitionist's life, see? The slave-holding family of the Fitzhugh living in Maryland decided to get out of slavery. And they sold their slaves and moved to Rochester about 1810, somewhere in there. He met the Fitzhugh family through his first wife, who died 7 months after they were married. So knew this young woman when she was probably about 13. And 3 to 4 years later, they married. So the slaveholding thing was a part of her past. And there's some very fascinating implications of that that come through the book, if you read it all, as to what happened to the slaves that Anne Carroll Fitzhugh Smith knew. So, and we're working on some of that restoration effort and display effort in Peterborough these days. She had a nanny that raised her, slave nanny. And so now she's mature and her husband is rich, and she says, I want you to find her. And he did. Through some of his agents, he found this nanny, a woman named Harriet Sims, living in Kentucky, still a slave, living on a plantation in Kentucky. So he said to his agents, buy her. Buy her freedom, bring her up here. But there was a problem. Harriet Sims had been married. Her name was now Harriet Russell, and she had 5 children. Now, what do you do? Smith said, buy them all. Bring them up. And he did. He paid $3,500, multiply that by 75, if you know how much that is today, and brought all these 7 people to Peterborough, and they lived in Peterborough the rest of their lives as free, working for wages. One of them, Harriet, the former nanny, worked as the Smith family laundress, and we are now in the process of restoring the laundry where she worked. It's actually still there. And the story is a fascinating one. Anyway, that's sort of an aside there. What he really is remembered for is the fact that he was an abolitionist. Most people can tell you like that. Oh, Gerrit Smith, he was an abolitionist. May even know he lived in Peterborough and might even know he was wealthy. Beyond that, not many people know a lot. But yeah, he was an abolitionist, but there were other things he was involved in also. So a couple of words on those before we get to the abolition thing. He was very interested in temperance. Boy, what a waste of time and money. It still is. We know that now. You know, if you mention prohibition or temperance, probably nobody is going to pay you very much serious attention if you're interested in actually achieving those goals, right? It's a waste. He didn't know that then, and he spent a lot of money and time and effort traveling around and speaking and spending for the achievement of temperance because he saw it as an evil which contributed to social ills like violence and split families and things like that, so he wanted to get it out of the way. Of course, it never happened. But it was always up here in his mind. And whenever there wasn't something else that was pressing, like women's rights or abolition, he'd charge off into temperance again and still do some more preaching on that. So it never left him. But he really never had the experience as we have with the prohibition thing to find out that it was a waste anyway. The women's rights issue, I think, is a fascinating one. By the way, as a footnote here, there's a couple more books coming. One was due to be published by the end of February. And I got word from the publisher just this week that it's not going to be. It's going to be another month or so. Anyway, it's a history of the abolition movement, the anti-slavery movement, starting in 1600 when the slaves first came to our shores, and tracing it right up through the Reconstruction era, which is post-Civil War. That will be available probably within a month. The title of it is Whatever It Takes. When you've got a big passionate goal you want to achieve, you do whatever it takes. And that's what the abolitionists did. The one I'm working on now is a book on the relationship between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Gerrit Smith. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's name usually raises eyebrows because most people tend to know a little bit about her. She lived right around here in central New York. The Seneca Falls area was important in getting the women's rights movement started. And she was a radical person. Yeah. Be careful what you say there. She really turned off a lot of people. She was so hot about women's rights, especially men, who were generally not interested in women's rights at the time. Women couldn't own property. You know, if you've been married to someone in central New York in 1840, all of your belongings became his, including your income if you had it. It was total domestic tyranny over women. And Elizabeth Cady was saying, whoa, this stinks. We need to do something about this. And do you know who her first cousin was? Gerrit Smith, of all things. Their mothers were sisters. Their mothers were both living sisters. And so she, born in 1815, he was born in 1797, so there was a few years there difference. She spent her summers as a young woman in Peterborough, living with the Smiths. She'd come up to Peterborough for extended months and live with them and learn. And she accredits in her own autobiography the fact that her interest in human rights was kindled around the dinner tables and in the discussions in Peterborough with Smith and other abolitionists who came. Smith is credited as being probably the most important and powerful abolitionist in the country. And that's a big one to swallow because there were thousands of abolitionists, but probably he was. And I'm getting a lot of agreement with this from other scholars now, that he was probably the most powerful abolitionist in the country because of his money. He could support anybody he wanted to, and they came to get it. And the list of people who came to Peterborough is what drops people's mouths open. William Lloyd Garrison, Elizabeth Stanton, of course, Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Joslyn Gage lived up in Fayetteville in the women's rights movement. They were close friends. Wendell Phillips, Boston abolitionist, powerful, wealthy man. John Brown, Frederick Douglass. They were all in Peterborough frequently. I mean, these are the names you're going to find right in the early pages of the chapters of history books. So that's because he was there. But the women's rights movement bothered him. he prided himself in being what he called a colored man. That's the word that was used then to refer to black skin. How could he think like that? He certainly wasn't dark skinned. How could he think like he said? He said it in public speeches, I am a colored man. And to me it makes sense. And here's why. He developed an empathy for especially young colored males. I think because he saw so many of them in trouble. They marched through his property as fugitives from slavery because he ran that underground railroad station. Hundreds of them, many hundreds of them came through. Tales of woe, of punishment, of abuse, scars all over their backs, teeth knocked out, ears cut off. Real people like this. And told him stories of what they had faced and how much their family had suffered. And he got to the point where this got inside him. He could get inside their heads. If following, you know, he began to think like one of them. That he really could think like one of them and feel the horrible punishment in life condition and lack of life chances that they faced. So he could call himself a colored man, and it actually makes sense to him. When it came to women, he wanted to have equality between the sexes. And there are some beautiful quotes that you'll see which indicate that man is man and woman is woman. There are no differences between the two sexes except biologically. Women can reproduce and have different hormones and body shapes. Men can't. So there are obvious differences like that. Nothing else. Everything else is equal. Intelligence, capacity, capabilities, everything. And so, therefore, they ought to be treated as equals to men. And this was a horrifying message for most men at the time. Horrifying. They were trying to string him up, saying things like that. So he had the philosophical mental base to do this. But when it came time, especially right after the Civil War, when it came time for women to actually achieve some of these goals, like through the vote, you see, right after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment had freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment had produced equality before the law, due process, that kind of thing. The 15th Amendment was enfranchisement of the black male. That's how it finally got written. Black males got the vote. Well, before it was passed, ratified, the women were saying, wait a minute, put us in there too. Make that amendment to the U.S. Constitution a franchise for all adults, not just for men, black or white. And Gerrit Smith and many other abolitionists said, wait your turn. Wagging a finger, maybe. No, it's the black man's turn now. Women need to wait. Besides which, Gerrit Smith actually said to Elizabeth Stanton, the women's movement is not in the right hands. Oh my God. Can you imagine saying that to her? I mean, she could have ripped his face off for that. So why? Why was he like this? Well, my hypothesis on this is one that's maybe going to open some eyes and make you think a lot. I hope it does. And that book on Stanton and Smith, which will be a couple years away, will do a lot more with this. He couldn't get inside a woman's head like he could get inside a black man's head and feel and empathize. I think the real key word here would be his feelings. He couldn't develop within himself the same kind of feelings that a woman had because women were oppressed too. And he sort of approved of it. He said there should never be anything like divorce. And if I ever leave my wife, she ought to sit around and wait for me to come back and accept me when I get there. That's his idea. So he just couldn't identify it as intensely. He couldn't develop the passion within him for the women's movement that he could develop for the anti-slavery movement. Follow that? He donated something like $50 million to the anti-slavery movement over his lifetime. and some to the women's movement, but not like that. So here's the note that is, I think, of importance. Men still have a terrible time conceiving of themselves as women. And when they do find that some can conceive of themselves as women, and they find that they are intensely discriminated against by both sexes. There are nasty names they get called: sissies, fags, queers. Most of the men who can successfully identify themselves as women are not gay. Something like 10% of them may be gay. But most gay men don't identify themselves as women. So there's an issue here that still boils around right on the surface of our lives that Smith faced, that kept him away from becoming passionately involved in the women's rights movement as he had become in the abolition. And it is the point that Elizabeth Cady Stanton made in a letter to him. She said to him, "Consider yourself as a woman." Now what would you think? And he couldn't do that. He just couldn't consider himself as a woman. And I'm maintaining today, you and I can't either. I'm pointing fingers all the days. It's a very difficult thing to accomplish in the face of the obvious discrimination you're going to face if you do that.
Some of us don't try.
No. So there's an issue, I think, that you know, if you want to pull something out of the history books and make something of it today, we can do this. And how can we ever expect women to achieve full equality with men until that can happen? Because men are the ones that are still in power. Well, how about the abolition movement? Wow. His involvement in that, we've already mentioned, probably the most powerful abolitionists in the country. He influenced all of them. Frederick Douglass moved up to Rochester in 1847. You know who Frederick Douglass is? Should I do anything with Frederick Douglass? Black abolitionist and escaped slave. He escaped from Maryland in 1838, moved up to the successful. Only half the slaves that tried to escape ever made it. And he moved up to the New England area, lived there for a few years, got to know William Lloyd Garrison, spoke at some of his meetings, eventually had to get away from Garrison because he didn't like his tactics, so he moved to Rochester to start a newspaper. Well, that's not a cheap thing to do. Douglass didn't have any money. Excuse me. He'd been a slave and he worked as a ship caulker in the New Bedford area around Boston. So he eventually moved out here, met Gerrit Smith. Aha, here's money. Gerrit Smith donated to Frederick Douglass about $100 a month. All the time that Douglass was publishing in his newspapers, the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper. The North Star started up in 1848. It ran until 1851 when it merged with the Liberty Party paper and became Frederick Douglass's paper. And then it went on. And Smith was donating $100 a month. Well, $100 a month. You know, we waste that on something. You're going to multiply that by 75. He was giving Douglass the equivalent of $7,500 a month to publish his paper for years. If it hadn't been for Smith, Douglass never would have printed a word. And Douglass was very powerful I call him a Black Abraham. I mean, he was a man of stature and power and importance in the anti-slavery movement. Very well respected. He had to write his first autobiography in 1845. He escaped in 1838. He had to write an autobiography in 1845 to prove to the people he was talking to that he used to be a slave. They wouldn't believe him. This man is too sophisticated. He never could have been a slave. So he wrote this thing. Nice little book about this big. Tiny little book, if you're interested in reading that stuff. One of the best slave narratives that exists. So he supported that. He supported speakers. He donated money to the American Anti-Slavery Society to supported speakers that went all over the country. He did a lot of public speaking himself on the abolition issue. He started the Liberty Party. He ran an underground railroad station. Any one of these things is a miracle. He did all of them. So as an abolitionist is how he is known. Now, one other thing probably should be mentioned here, because it's associated with the abolition movement through John Brown. You know he supported Brown, right? John Brown is a guy that invaded Harper's Ferry, was caught by the U.S. military and eventually hanged for treason against the state of Virginia, of all things, for having invaded a federal U.S. arsenal. Some legal questions there that these days you could throw the case out like this, but then it was important. So why was he messing around with John Brown? Gerrit Smith was vice president of the American Peace Society. And here he is supporting a man that's advocating violence. Smith started out his abolition work supporting what was called moral suasion. We would call it persuasion. That is, we can get rid of slavery, by going down into the South and talking to slave owners and telling them what you're doing is sinful. It's morally repugnant. You should not own other people. You must divest yourself of slavery. And as soon as they see the reasonableness of this and the primacy of natural law, as they call it, divine law, over human law, they will realize their mistake and sell their slave. Well, you give that to raspberry, right? That didn't get anywhere. But these original abolitionists didn't realize they weren't going to get anywhere with that, and they tried it for almost 10 years. Wendell Phillips, a guy from Boston, finally said, we have wasted our time for 10 years. What should we do next? Well, Smith had an idea that was so unpopular that Phillips and Garrison and many of the other Boston clique of abolitionists said, get away from us. We don't want anything to do with you anymore. And that was start a party, political party. Because they weren't politically oriented, but Smith was. Smith hated politics himself, but he would support it because he could see that as a way to get enough abolitionist legislators elected to the legislatures to pass rules against slavery. That makes sense. So let's try. So he tried that for 10 years. Didn't seem to work either. The party split apart, lots of factions, lots of infighting. Another decade lost up until 1850, and still nothing going on, and somebody came knocking on Smith's door. A guy named John Brown. Brown had learned about Smith's money and his liberal ideas through his father. He was a trustee at Oberlin College, and Smith had given him a lot of money and land. So he came to Peterborough and knocked on Smith's door and said, I'm an abolitionist too, but my ideas are different than yours. We need to talk, and I need money. Smith listened. He decided to agree with Brown. Persuasion in politics had been two decades of wasted effort. What we really need to do is perform something a little more active. So Brown was advocating violence. We need to make war with slave owners. They're not going to listen to anything else. We need to do something that will successfully destabilize Southern culture, the Southern way of life. The whole institution of slavery has to become a threat to the slave owners. Well, how do we do that? We scare the pants off. We invade them. We go down there into the South, into the slaveholding state, and make a war. And they will become so paranoid about the fact that these darn idiot northern abolitionists are going to keep doing this. Next thing, they'll come from Virginia to Georgia, and what are we going to do about these guys? The North was a lot more powerful. They knew that. The industrial capability, the population was larger, the intellectual capabilities were better. I mean, the South knew this. So they're saying, what are we going to do? We better shoot first. So what did they shoot at? Fort Sumter. They blew Fort Sumter to bits. And of course that started the Civil War. It was right off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. It was a northern fort, right off the coast. Shot heard around the world or something like that. They blew it to bits, and then there was a war. John Brown actually did exactly what he intended to do. And so many people have given him a bad rap as having been a failure, because he went to Harper's Ferry and he got captured and was killed. That's the end of that. No, that was a commencement more than an ending. And he knew that was going to happen. He wasn't dumb. He understood what would probably happen. He was hoping it wouldn't go that way, but when it did, he was acknowledging that it was still okay. He said, now the institution of slavery will die. Which it did. And where did he get his money from to do that? Our friend Gerrit gave him the money to go buy arms, buy ammunition, train soldiers, pay people, hire people to train the soldiers, and march into the South and capture a federal arsenal and scare the lizards out of the southern slave owners. And they finally said, we're going to keep the North away from us by shooting back at them, and of course, it was. So that's the intensity of Smith's dedication to the business of abolition. And he got around to that by being a practical dreamer. If you're digging a hole with a spoon and it's not working too well, for goodness sakes, get a shovel. And if the shovel doesn't work too well, get a jackhammer. You just get a hold of the right tool and you'll get the job done. Well, moral suasion wasn't the right tool, politics wasn't the right tool, but violence was. And he was willing to change with the times, different ideas, to pull that off. And he's been roundly criticized for this. People say, well, an inconsistent, unpredictable, egocentric goon. That was that third biography. And, well, you can interpret it that way if you wish. But I see it a different way. He had the brains to say, this isn't working too well, let's try something that might work better. He's a good administrator. I don't know if there's any administrators here. I was in education all my life and I saw a lot of them at work. I was never an administrator. But I worked for some pretty good ones who were willing to say, you know something, fellows? This isn't working. We tried something different here for a few months and it's not working too well. Let's scrap that, pull back, put everybody back where they were and start again. Now, in a sense, an administrator that does that is calling themselves a fool. They wasted time and money and people's attitudes and all that, but, you know, the next time around it may work better. That's all he did. So he was a good thinker and a good administrator of the policies that eventually led to the destruction of slavery. Well, when I wrote the epilogue to the book, epilogue is the last little piece where the author gets a chance to throw in his own opinion. You might even want to read that first. I did. Now, when I pick up any book, I read the epilogue first. This is where you get what the guy really thinks. Then you go back and read the book. But I wrote it in the land office. I just couldn't resist. I went over there one dark, rainy night in November, set up a couple of kerosene lanterns on the table in Smith's land office. I wrote the epilogue. I hope there's some feeling in it there. And the message that he leaves us, what's the relevance of Gerrit Smith for today, is what we were talking about just a few minutes ago. Why do we have to discriminate? Do you want to be hated? Of course not. Well then, I'll look up here. Why do you hate us? We do. We continue to discriminate. We discriminate against you. Who do you live with? One of the things I used to do in my class, I'll end with this. I taught sociology at Morrisville. This is the discipline that really digs into the social life, you know. And I'd take a piece of chalk and say, let's make a list on the board of all the categories of people in American history that have been discriminated against. And of course, somebody said, Vinny, African Americans, you write that. Women, you write that. Latinos, you write that. Native Americans, you write that. And the list grows, and then you say, wait a minute. Yeah. Wait a minute, now tell me, for the most part, who is not on the list? White men. White males. Well, why aren't they on the list? Say it. They're the ones that are doing it. They don't put themselves on the list. So we're there. We're there now. We're there today. We're still doing this. crass oversimplification of the issues, I agree. But, yeah, and when we find that there are still people that are barking about human rights, they include Latinos, gay, lesbian, there's a whole movement on that, just like there was an anti-slavery movement in the 1800s, and others. And the message is clear. Love everybody. You can't do that unless you love yourself intensely, but that he did. Okay, you got any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I still don't understand where he got that fervor for all these causes.
That's good.
He didn't like his father. He wasn't religious when he was young. Did his mother have those feelings?
No, well, not to that extent that early. She supported everything they did, and that's an important point. There's a long chapter on Ann Smith in here.
But so where did he get it?
Um,
Influence.
Well, let me try. I tried to answer that. Where did he get his philanthropic ideas? And philanthropy can refer to the fact that you give away whatever resource you've got. It can be money, it could be time, it could be expertise, right? What is it, time, treasure? You know, whatever you've got, you can give it away and feel good about it. It may have been that he felt somewhat guilty over having so much money. It may have been because he did become a devout Christian in 1826. This was 7 years after he got out of college. And that may have contributed to it, because Christianity does do some things about that. But I think the real answer to the question of where did he get this attitude from is, we don't know. That doesn't help you a bit. See? I think there's an answer that is yet to be discovered. And we're getting closer and closer and closer to it. And I think it's probably genetic. That is, he was hardwired for something that says, be selfless and do good for other people other than yourself. There are people that way today. And it's very difficult to explain how they got that way, just as it is with him. And other people are extremely selfish and want to hoard everything they can and won't go to a public meeting or volunteer for anything. Why? That's the way they're wired. And you can go back and say, well, it was their environment, their father didn't like this, or their mother didn't, and they got experiences that drove them away from other people when they were young. Yeah, that's part of it too. But there are people who experienced all that stuff and are still philanthropic too. So it doesn't explain it. So I think we're getting there, and just a second, there, as tantalizing little bits of evidence of this, we know now that a tendency toward alcoholism is inherited. We know now that your sexual preference is inherited. You and I, or any of us, didn't have a choice. Did you sit down one day and say, gee, I think I'll be heterosexual? No, you didn't have any choice about that. Well, neither do homosexual people. They're no different than the rest of us. And we know that. It's wired in genetically. And we can prove it by citing the specific genes that do that. A lot of traits that we always thought were learned are beginning to pop out of the Genome Project now as being controlled by hardwired factors that were there when you were born, and they may or may not appear depending upon the environment you're in, but the tendency is very strong. I think that probably explains a lot.
I have a comment on her question.
Yeah.
To me, it might be also that no amount of money, of his father's money, could keep his mother alive that he loved so dearly. And no amount of money could make his father happy after she died, so that he walked away from everything. And besides the genetics, which he probably got from his mom, and I'm not saying that because of the way the father reacted to everything, otherwise the father would have reacted differently, that he probably thought, money is not love. People are love, and I lost my mom. And
In a very close relationship with his mother.
that's right, and I just think that money wasn't everything to him, and that's why he was so, wanted to make everybody. I come from a fix-it child of an alcoholic family, and I always thought, until deep counseling, that if I could make everybody else happy, and the world, it would be all right. And you can't do that.
No.
My question is, about my hero, Abraham Lincoln. Was he ever in Peterborough? Did they ever have a relationship? Did they ever, you know, coincide or?
I wish I could say yes.
Okay.
As far as I know, Abraham Lincoln never visited Peterborough, no. They did have a relationship, a communicated one, through letters.
Okay, oh, okay.
Yeah, and they're there to read. The
Wow.
gist of it is that Smith criticized Lincoln intensely, especially after the Civil War started, because of the way he was operating the war, which didn't make any sense to Smith or any of the abolitionists, really. Lincoln started out the war calling it a war for reunion, save the Union. It wasn't. It was always over slavery, and Lincoln didn't figure this out until late 1862, a year and a half after the war started. He finally said, maybe these guys are right. This is being fought over slavery, and I ought to do something about that. So then the Emancipation Proclamation came out. But he wasn't an abolitionist, you know that.
Oh, yeah.
Lincoln.
Well, politically, if he couldn't have said at the beginning of the war that it was about slavery.
That's right.
He had to say it was about preserving the Union, or
Right.
he wouldn't have support.
Yeah, but even though most of his support came from the North, he didn't get a single electoral vote.
No, the people in the North, the people who were elected,
Yeah,
were not as elected in.
yeah, that's
Even
correct.
those in the North.
That's right. And the base of that, obviously, is that slavery existed in the North. Now, it may not have existed legally in the North, but it existed in people's minds because they supported it. And you're right in saying that he wouldn't have been elected had he said it was about slavery to begin with. Yeah.
When John Brown was caught, that kind of tarnished his image.
Sure.
But I mean, did he go to jail?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. How much time have I got? No.
Let's see if they riot or not.
They might riot because they don't have time.
Nobody's walked out yet. Nobody's gone to sleep.
You're on a roll.
What was the effect of John Brown, the John Brown connection? Smith spent the rest of his life after 1859 denying that he was involved with John Brown. Yeah. Because he was embarrassed over the fact that Brown had gone into the South and committed murder, been accused of treason, and was killed. And this stained Smith's reputation, he felt. So he denied that he ever, what he really denied was, the specific thing he denied was this, that he knew what John Brown was going to do with his money. He said, I gave him money to do whatever he wanted to do, and he didn't tell me what he was going to do, and that was probably true. In all the analysis I've been able to make in this long study, that's probably true, that Smith did not know that John Brown was going to attack a federal arsenal. He knew Brown was going to go into the South, into slave territory, and do something which probably would contribute to destabilizing the institution of slavery. But Smith's idea was that he was going to go down there and try to develop stations on like a route so that slaves could follow this, what Brown was calling a subterranean pathway north, and get out of slavery. And Smith was supporting this. He didn't know Brown was going to go down there and blow the place up. But he did. So then what happened? Smith was one of the secret six that supported, with money, this effort of John Brown. But something like 90-some% of the money came from Smith. The others were 5 people from the Boston area that contributed what they could, but it wasn't a lot. So you can say Smith substantially funded Brown's effort. After Brown was captured, Smith realized that he was going to be probably indicted for conspiracy against the United States government for having supported Brown, because in Brown's possession, when he was captured, was an uncashed check from Gerrit Smith for $100, which was a lot of money then, remember? So there was a hard paper trail. You can wonder whether or not he was involved here, you see. There's no question about what he was. The other 5 men of the secret 6, 5 of them escaped the country by going either to Canada or overseas because they knew they were going to get caught too. And one guy named Higginson stayed in Boston and just thumbed his nose at the authorities and said, come and get me if you want, I don't care. Well, they never did. And Smith ended up, he had a hallucinatory episode in his life. And he ended up in the insane asylum in Utica, Marcy, these days. And this is one of the things he seems to be well known for, even by novices who haven't read the books yet. They, oh, wasn't he nuts? Did he go in a slam or somewhere? Yeah, he did. But let me tell you about that. It's only so much time with me. He was in the, let's do the finish of it first, and I'll tell you how it happened. He was in the insane asylum, that was what it was called then, for 4 weeks. That's a very short stay. And after that, he spent 3 weeks in the home of the psychiatrist that had been treating him. Then it sort of was a transition back to going back home again. Then he came home to Peterborough and lived the rest of his life. And it never happened again. And it had never happened before that. He was 62 years old when this happened. It had never happened previously in his life. He had this one episode, it was a manic depressive moment. And then it never happened again for the rest of his life. So think about yourself or people you know who have had to have treatment for some sort of a psychological problem once in their lives and then never characterize them again. Would it not be somewhat absurd to remember them for just that? That's not their whole life, for goodness sakes. All right, well, that's what happened. Now, how did it happen? He had spent the 10-year decade of the 1850s facing stressors in his life, which would put anybody away for a little while. They were raising a teenage son who was a rebel, a drunkard, a card player, and wanted nothing to do with business or Peterborough. This is the young man, the only young man they had that lived to adulthood. They had 7 children, 5 of them died in childhood. The only one that lived to adulthood that was a male was Green. He became a well-renowned ornithologist later in his life. But he only lived to age 38, died of tuberculosis. We could cure that today, but they didn't know what to do about it. So they were facing this teenage rebel in a home which was the ultra-moral, reformer-oriented, and they had awful, awful times with him. They sent him away to moral training school when he was 9, and they sent him to the moral training school that was run in New Jersey by Theodore Dwight Well.
Are Theodore Well from here?
Yes. Yes. He and his wife, he had married Angelina Greencape at that time, who was an abolitionist, a slave owner's daughter. And they had moved to New Jersey. This was by 1851. They had moved to New Jersey and started what you call probably a reform school for people who were in psychological trouble. And that's where they sent him. And that's how worried they were. Well, anyway, that's too much on Green. This is in the early 1850s. I'm leading up to 1859 when Brown invaded Harper's Ferry. So he's dealing with that. He's also dealing with marital troubles. That's not in any of the other biographies you read. I discovered that in their letters to each other back and forth in the mid-1850s. They went through a midlife crisis where he came right out and said, I wonder if I ever should have married. I should have kept my single bed, as he put it. And they had troubles back and forth. They weathered it, okay? They got through it eventually after that period. But he was dealing with that. He was dealing with typhoid fever. That's a killer. He went into the hospital several times over that. He was dealing with a chronic problem of hemorrhoids, which bugged him for most of his adult life. And it was so painful at times that he could not stand or walk or sit or what else. And he was a busy man. He had to work all the time. He worked in his little land office there in Peterborough, an average of 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week for 55 years. He was a micromanager. He was there doing his work. He couldn't afford not to be there. He frequently didn't travel even when he was invited to come as a guest speaker or some sort of a participant in a conference because my press of business is so much I can't do. And he was right. Besides which he didn't like to travel. So it was a good excuse. But so when he got into those situations, he would lie on his side on a couch and do his paperwork on the floor. So he faced that for that decade. And other things. But the point is, by the time of the end of the decade, he was so stressed that he was ready to break. And this John Brown thing was the last straw. That did it. When that happened, he said, oh my gosh, I'm going to be indicted. He had newspaper reporters banging on his door, standing on his front porch. He couldn't keep them away. He had his house guarded to keep the reporters away from him for a few days. Didn't last long. And then he went, his family, it was his family that took him to Utica, not him. What he wanted to do, he said, I am as guilty as is John Brown in this case in Virginia, because I gave him the money to do everything he did. I ought to stand trial with him. Take me there. And his family, and this is a personal account written up by his clerk, and his clerk and he were very close, so he knew this. His family said, okay. They packed his bags, they got him in the wagon, they took him to Utica. He thought he was going up there to get the train, but they took him to the insane asylum, and fortunately, Smith knew this doctor up there, who was what you and I would call a psychiatrist. That word didn't exist then. But this guy had just come up with a revolutionary theory about what to do about mental illness. Up until that time, this was the mid-1800s, people were treated for mental illness with rather brutal techniques. You know, cut a hole in the skull to let the demons out, trephining, spin them in chairs, throw out the bad parts, jump on them. Well, they were all forms of shock treatment, which sometimes actually worked. But this guy, this doctor up in Utica, had come up with a brand new idea which said the cause of mental illness is stress. Yeah, has to catch it. This is, you and I know this. It's just silly not to know that. They didn't know anything about that, man. So this guy had a radical idea, and he said, let's treat Smith as if this is what's happening. Stress is causing this. First, get him away from the stress-producing situation. Get him out of his house. He was distrusting his wife and his daughter, who still lived there, his household help, his friends and neighbors. He thought they were all out to get him. And this is delusional, right? This is delusions of persecution. It's on page 149 of your psych book, probably, you know. And so they said, we got to get him out of here. And Dr. Gray, his name was, took him up there. He spent a little time in the mental hospital undergoing treatments, a lot of which were what we call drug treatments. What did they have for drugs? They had two major drugs at the time. Cannabis, mind-altering drug, right? And diet change. And believe it or not, alcohol. Many of the medicines were called anodynes. And an anodyne is sort of a generic word that means some kind of a depressant. It helps by toning down the mania. And you look at the bottles. I've got a bunch of these. I've brought an antique store. The bottles. Dr. So-and-so, magical elixir, you know, and you read through, it cures everything you could possibly imagine, but it's 83% alcohol. A few swigs of that, you'll feel different. So that's what that's all about. Yes, he reacted in a strange way after John Brown's failure at the moment in Harper's Ferry. But it didn't last long, and he went back home and became average person again and ran his business for the rest of his life, and it never happened again. And it's too bad that he got known for that. But you know what the point is here? At the time it happened, he loved the news. I've been through the newspapers. Long columns. Gerrit Smith gone nuts. In the hospital for the mentally insane. And long stories of that. Or all of the other things he did.
Was that illness the reason he wasn't indicted, and could it have been feigned to accomplish that purpose?
I'm going to say no. But, yes, in a way, because the person that was responsible for the trial was the governor of Virginia at the time, who was Henry Wise. Henry Wise was a racist. No question about that. It's well documented these days. And he went immediately for a trial for treason against the state of Virginia because he didn't want the United States federal government to take it over as a trial for treason against the country. He wanted to get these guys. See? But you know who he went after? He spent a lot of time and money and effort chasing Frederick Douglass. Douglass wasn't even in it. Douglass had met with Brown a few weeks before the raid down in Chambersburg. And he told him, don't do this. This is dumb. If you invade Harper's Ferry, you're going to get caught and killed. And I'm not coming with you. Brown wanted Douglass to go with him on the raid. Douglass says, you're nuts. No way. I'm not going down there with you. Yet when it came time to go after the people who were involved, Governor Wise went after Frederick Douglass. And he said about all the rest of them, no, we'll probably never prove anything against him. Let's leave him alone. So, most of them weren't indicted or subpoenaed, and they never had to testify. A couple of them did. Well, after the testifying was the Mason Committee that investigated the Harper's Ferry. After they testified in front of the Mason Committee, yeah, the same Mason, Dixon Line, he was a senator at the time. After they testified in front of the Mason Committee, they came home and said they didn't really ask us any questions that were relevant. And I wasn't going to tell them something they weren't asking me about. So essentially, they let all these rich white boys off the hook. And I think it was just a racist thing.
How old was Gerrit Smith, and is he buried at Peterborough?
He's buried in the Peterborough Cemetery just east of the village, and when he died, he was 77. Now, he died of a stroke. He had been experiencing problems in the previous months with what he called vertigo. It's little spells of dizziness, and he had letters that he'd written about that to some of his correspondents, and one of them actually wrote back and said, I'm glad that your episodes of vertigo have slackened. We hope you'll be okay. Well, it was probably a precursor to the fact that he was having blood flow problems to the brain. He was making him dizzy. And he went down to New York City. His wife, Anne, was frequently away from Peterborough, especially in the winter. Can't imagine why she didn't like Peterborough in winter. She'd go south, and south was either Philadelphia or New York City, which was south in those days. And she'd visit relatives. She was down in New York City visiting relatives for Christmas, and he went down there to visit her over the Christmas holidays, and he died there while he was with her. He got up in the morning, felt weak, laid back down in the bed and experienced a massive stroke that paralyzed half his body, and he died the next day.
I'm impressed with your knowledge, by the way.
Thank you. Yes?
Are his descendants, any descendants still living in
No.
Peterborough?
No. No, the family essentially died out over the years, and people say, well, how could that happen? A lot of the folks who were married as part of the original family never had any children, or their children died. And so, no, there's nothing left of the Smith family. And the fortune, what happened to that? That we need research on. Want to do something about that? We need research, especially for the life of his grandson, Gerrit Smith Miller. His daughter, Elizabeth, who was also active in the women's rights movement, Elizabeth Smith Miller, married Charles Dudley Miller. They had a son they named Gerrit Smith Miller. And he became a state legislator, an important person, but he never worked. I don't think he had to. You know, I mean, he did have income-producing things, like he was the guy that introduced the first Holstein registered herd into the country. There's a marker up there in Peterborough for that. And he did other things, too, that were important. But it appears that he never had a job. I think that the fortune, as it was remaining when Smith died, gets spent off over the years. It's just gone.
Who preserved the papers?
Oh, boy. The papers were in the Gerrit Smith mansion. They were left there by the Smith family when they died. And the curator, the person that was in charge of them, was Gerrit Smith Miller, his grandson, who was living there in the 1920s and 30s. And in 1928, Gerrit Smith Miller became acquainted with the librarian at Syracuse University. I'm not sure how. They got to know each other. And the librarian said, you know what? All those papers that belong to the Smith family are in your house. They shouldn't be there. They should be cataloged and placed for public use. And Mr. Miller said, that makes sense, so he donated. He donated all the papers of the Gerrit Smith family to the Syracuse University, and 8 years later, the mansion burned. The Gerrit Smith home in Peterborough burned to the ground in 1936. In the middle of the winter. They had a furnace problem. They just had a new furnace installed, and we assume it was some problem with that because it seems to have started in the cellar, going up through the chimney area. So, it was March 2nd. The temperature was 10 below zero, and there was no water. You stand around and watch it burn. And they pulled a lot of stuff out. There's pictures of it. There was a journalist driving by the day it burned, and he took a lot of pictures. They were in the newspapers, so we can still look at those. A picture of the thing in flames and all the people carrying out furniture. The front lawn, which is full of snow, of course, was littered with furniture and stuff they pulled out of the house. But one of the most interesting things, I remembered,
Yes.
I told John before, I don't say anything about this, you asked me. He kept a diary. Smith kept a diary all his life. And I got one 1839 letter I found when he was writing to someone else, and he said, my diary is 400 pages long. This is handwritten. Well, he lived until 1874. So it must have been like about 1,000 pages long by that time, because I know also he kept it right up until his death. The first biography that was written about Gerrit Smith was written by a guy by the name of Frothingham, who was a family friend and had been a minister in Peterborough during Gerrit Smith's life, but had moved to Boston, and he was a scholar of sorts. So the family commissioned him to write a biography. That wasn't unusual in those days. When an important person died, the family would commission a friend to write. They did this, and they sent him the diary in Boston. So he had it. And in his biography, if you read that one, you will find some comments directly out of the diary. I have used a few of them here, not like he did. Well, where is it? If he had it, he sent it back to Peterborough. We know that. Where did it go? His family that remained after the biography was written in 1878, this was just a year or so after he died. And by the way, his wife died 3 months after he did. Very interesting story. You want to read about that. Because I have a hypothesis there too. But so they weren't alive when the biography came out, but his children were. His children open this biography and read it, and they say, oh, that wasn't supposed to be in there. And what is in the first edition of that biography is all the stuff with John Brown. The letters from John Brown, everything is in there. What Smith knew and when he knew it. Well, Smith didn't want the public to know this, so they sent it back. And they said to the author, purge it. Take all that stuff out. And the guy did. I mean, I would have told him to go pound sand somewhere. All of that stuff was wrong. But he did. He took the book back, and he took out all those references to John Brown and Gerrit Smith together. And then he reissued the book, and that's what most people read. I have a copy of the first edition. I can open them both up and see what he took out. And if you're interested in any of this kind of deeper stuff, in the mercantile store of the Gerrit Smith estate in Peterborough, we have something like 20-some copies of that first edition for sale. It was republished in 1969 by Negro Universities Press as part of a history project they did. And they republished the first edition, which is great.
What,
We got
because
all the good stuff in it.
he didn't destroy it?
It was
Even though it was sent back?
already published.
The diary,
It was in print already.
Uh-oh.
it was a reprint. Yeah, I've
So
actually
the
got,
original one was in print already.
Yes, it
even though
was.
He revised it.
But the
Yes.
diary has never been seen again.
Diary. Let's finish that. In the 1930s, when a man named Harlow, who wrote the third biography, the one that was so critical of, said to Gerrit Smith Miller, who was alive at the time, his grandson, he said, "I know nothing about a diary." That's quoted in the book. That's BS. That's all it is. Of course he knew about the diary. The letters, I know about the diary. Well, how about Gerrit Smith Miller say, "I don't know anything about it"? He had it, I think. He had it. And he knew of it, and knew what was in it. And when he turned all the papers over to SU, kept it. Then the house burned. I think that's probably what happened.
Was he still alive when the house burned?
He was. Yes, where's that? Yes. Yes, he was 90. He lived about another year. Gerrit Smith Miller. And he bought another house right back of where the mansion was. He lived there for another year before he died.
And he had no children.
He had children, but they married and did not. So that's how it died out.
Well, this has been fantastic.
Yes, thank you.
Folks, I've been in teaching all my life, and you just saw a really great teacher at work today.
I'm just wondering, when is the Peterborough reenactment?
Here are some posters of the Peterborough Civil War weekend. And on this weekend, the second weekend in June, we will have the land office open, the museum is open, the Gerrit Smith Estate Visitor Center is open. All the historical displays are there to read and learn from. These are meant, these are meant as posters. If you've got a place you'd like to pin one of these up in a store or post office or somewhere, please take one.
Yeah, that was that.
We got some great refreshments over here. Don't